Chris, have you got time for coffee?
I sure do. I've got a coffee right here in a little children's teacup. And
That looks like a child could fit in the teacup.
okay, so it's a little bit bigger than a children's teacup. But it's
Nice.
it's it's good. I've been practicing my coffee grinding and brewing. I use a mocha pot and
What's a
anyway,
mocha pot? What makes it different?
so the mocha pot is a stovetop pressure vessel, and it's made in Italy by a company called Bialetti, I think, and it's got this very cute little man drawing with pointing his finger up. And the whole idea is you put water in the base, you screw the base on, and in the middle there's a tiny little holder for ground coffee,
Right.
and you screw it on top. And in the top section, there's essentially a container for brewed coffee. So when you put it on the stove, the water in the vessel at the bottom begins to boil, and that builds up pressure such that the pressure pushes hot water up through the container of coffee and into the holder at the top. So it's not the same pressure as a actual espresso. And some people say mocha pots make espresso, but technically it's not really espresso because it's a lower pressure. It's kind of its own thing. Like you
It's
can
not
have
a mixture of chocolate and coffee then, because it's mocha.
a MOKA, mocha pot.
That's like really deceptive advertising because I do love mochas. But
Ah,
talking of pressure,
mm, yes, please.
it does feel like, yeah. Do you know what's so interesting with this talk of Trump making a deal with Ukraine around its minerals? You know, like it's so cynical. I mean, it feels really cynical, but this whole thing with US aid as well, it's like the mask is coming off.
Mm, mhm.
And all these things that were already happening are now being laid bare for what the real purpose was. So it's like with the Gulf War and et cetera, et cetera. Like when Israel began the latest genocidal attack, October 7th, 2023, um, within a couple of days, they were in talks with British Petroleum to sell the oil that was like in Gaza part of,
Oh, I
I
didn't
mean,
know that.
yeah. So it's like those kinds of things are like behind the scenes usually. It's
Hmm.
like, what are the real motives? But then Trump comes along and it's like, well, to put Trump Tower hotels on the beach in Gaza and to get the minerals out of Ukraine, of course. And we want control of Greenland and we might as well have Canada. Um, it's just like no longer hidden the imperialist drive, the colonial drive, the capitalist drive. Um, they usually want minerals because it's gonna support like technology or green tech or something. They all know the pressure of climate change is here and all of that. And so it's just more blatant. It's like it's not even pretending to be like a far right like Christian thing or we need to go back to tradition, women, dot, dot, dot. This is just like blatant, naked um, money. Like we want the money, we want the power, we want the region, we want the resources, and we don't need to pretend anymore. And USAID as well has quite a reputation for like it's a way to um, pressure countries into doing things that the US wants. So they give give them things in exchange for like the goodwill of like letting our military be there or, like all kinds of things that they can control. And so then they take that away, probably because they're like, we don't need to pretend like to help people. Let's just dominate them to get them to do what we want rather than a facade of we're supporting AIDS treatments or LGBTQIA plus stuff. It's just a lot more in your face. It's a lot more honest. I'm not complimenting them, but it is true that not much has changed in terms of motivations. It's just how it's being like the PR around it is like they're not trying to pretend anymore.
Yeah, and I think there are many levels at which to look at this. I've been listening to various resources, not anything that I have right in front of me at the moment. Various resources, maybe I should say really people's opinions, just to be clear about this. Some people have the opinion that America became a superpower not because it was the best at X, Y, or Z, but because it was the only power left standing after World War II. Europe was destroyed. Japan was destroyed. The United States, with some rare exceptions, escaped being bombed on its own homeland, which, of course, was not the case for Europe, whether Eastern Europe or Western Europe. So somebody had served up their opinion that America had won by default, which I think is an interesting notion. And so what does that mean in terms of our conversation today? And just keeping in mind, World War II was, I mean, in the span of human history, it was just a blink of an eye ago. The so-called post-World War II order, if you will, it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of human history. Now, of course, living in the middle of it, it feels like a long time. And perhaps every day for some people feels like a long time, given how quickly things are changing. But I want to build on what you're saying about how it's not even hidden anymore, what the United States agenda in many cases has always been. There's two things that come to mind. One is it is possible for more than one thing to be true at once. So we've talked in the past. In fact, I think in one of our first podcasts episodes, you talked about a peer of yours who was directly impacted by cuts to government funding, somebody who is not in the United States, but is actually outside the United States, but took United States funding for AIDS and HIV type of work. So I believe, yes, it is possible to use things like funding to do good in such a way that you magnify your own influence. And we can find many, many examples of that, not just in foreign policy, but in many domains. So I acknowledge that in some sense, and of course, there's always this question of what is the definition of good? I was about to say, in some sense, yes, there are elements of the United States foreign policy that have done good in the world. But underneath that is this idea of how can we also protect our interests? Now, the word our, and I've talked about who is we, oftentimes, it's a big habit of mine, asking who is we. Well, who are our interests? And in a way, you've already talked just now about our interest, so-called, or quote unquote, our interests, also being very much the interests of capital, right? Very much the interests of money. And sometimes I have this idea in my head. It's not something I formalized, but basically it goes like the following. what does it mean to think like a billionaire? And sometimes I raise this question in my head and kind of laugh at myself with it, because when I answer it, there's a few things that come to mind. One is thinking like a billionaire means, why would we not use all this money that we have to get more money? Right? Well, what's point two of thinking like a billionaire? Why would we not use all this power that we have to get more power? So, in some sense, looking at the actions of the United States, if indeed that's the mental framing, and I don't know because I'm not a billionaire, so I don't know what it's like to think like a billionaire, but this idea of money is power, but also power is power, from that lens, it seems to make sense. Like there's a certain strange consistency in what's going on. A consistency that in many ways, not all, but in many ways has been there all along, but now is much more naked. So about a week ago, I watched a video by the YouTuber and journalist Owen Jones entitled Ukraine's Defeat and the Fall of the West. And in this video, Owen Jones includes clips from Donald Trump talking to the White House press corps at the White House. And he is very clear, Mr. Trump, and I'm actually listening to this at the moment, so because I want to capture the words. He says about the Ukraine war, Mr. Trump, he says, in some form, we're going to get this money back. And then he goes on to talk about what does it mean to get the money back? Well, oil, gas, and mineral rights. And he doesn't hide it. He speaks about it openly. He speaks about this notion that, well, the United States has invested way more money in this war than Europe. He throws out this number, $350 billion, which I think is not a real number. And then he says, quote, we're going to get this money back in terms of basically, like I just said, oil, gas, and mineral rights. But when I think about this in terms of something that you and I have talked often about, which is relationship building, it brings up a certain kind of imagery in my head. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I thought to myself, what does it mean to be an ally? And I'm speaking generally. I'm not speaking in terms of the jargon of foreign policy, because that's not my background. But in general, what does it mean to be an ally? I think to myself, yes, I do something for you, you do something for me, but it's not a transaction as an expectation. It's because we have a relationship, we have shared values, therefore we support each other. I may be in need right now, and you support me. You may be in need in the future, and then I will support you. But something transactional is a little bit different. It's, if you're in need, I will help you, but then you pay me back, ideally with interest or with profit later. So I don't consider those to be the same. They may look the same on the surface, but there's a distinction. The first is, you're my ally. I care about you as an entity. The second is, I care about what you can do for me. And that's why I'm helping you. And I feel like the approach of this administration is very much the second category. So Trump referring to himself as a deal maker, this is the language of extraction. And yes, to a certain degree, that has always been there in terms of the post-World War II ethos of America. I mean, this is a country with 800 military bases all across the world to spread influence and protects its interests. So yes, that has always been there. I'm not sure I would say now it's more blatant. Yes, it is more blatant, but I think it's also accelerated. It's also become more broad in a way that perhaps was not as true before this administration and before the first Trump administration of 2016. And again, I'm not a foreign policy specialist. I'm certainly not a real estate investor. So I can't speak from that lens, but I'm speaking more from the position of somebody, a citizen of the US, who sees these things going on. And on the one hand, is trying to make sense of it. And on the other hand, is trying to figure out, does it make sense at all? Is it even worth trying to make sense of what's going on? Because where is the consistency? The only consistency I can think of, the only rationality I can think of is it's all about power.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was in Joyful Militancy or in Being Numerous, um, where they spoke about the first principles of the far right are power and domination. So trying to rationalize and reason with them on anything else just won't work. Um, yeah, and this thing around, is the US doing good, like at the same time that it's doing, it's like you know, someone who abuses their partner and also pays for their health care. you know, it's like, I think there are other ways to give health care
Hmm.
rather than it has to be the abuser doing it, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I can't speak to this, but you referenced Owen Jones, and he's a he's got mixed, he's mixed
Hmm.
on and I tried to quickly check like what the latest was on him.
Hmm.
And because there are things around being Zionist and,
Hmm.
you know, stuff like that. But I can't tell whether it's cleared up now or not. But I know that he's like a problematic figure on the left in the
Hmm.
UK. But
Hmm.
I don't know enough, like
Hmm.
if that's come out in the wash now or what. I just want people listening to know that like it might be problematic, but I'm not sure. And I
Hmm.
haven't kept up with Owen Jones. But yeah, thinking like a billionaire. It's like impossible to think like you it I mean, when it comes to Elon Musk in particular, it's like I just can imagine like it being so fun. Like he thinks it's so fun to be able to have so much control over things and to
Hmm.
have people fawning over me
Hmm.
and treating the world like a video game, you
Hmm.
know, where you're like, you get to control everything, you know, like what would you do? Like, how would you reallocate resources if you had this much money and influence, power? And then some of the other people, it's the same. It's like this tech dream, you
Hmm.
know, of like the role of AI and the role of like going to Mars and, you know, like it's like, oh, we get to try to shape the world the way that we want it. And there's some kind of some things obviously happen to these little boys,
Hmm.
you know, when they were young that made them not be able to think about other people's suffering and care about people and think about how, oh, I want to use all my access to resources to help people
Hmm.
rather than look at it as some big project with fake people like a video game. You know, that's kind of what it feels like to think like a billionaire.
Interesting you say that because I pulled up a video, started watching it earlier this morning. It's more in the form of a podcast. It does have visuals, but the title of this is Elon Musk, the Early Warning Signs, and in quotes, Musk versus Eberhard, Part 1. And it goes through a lawsuit that was filed by one of the original founders of the car company named Tesla, and he has the last name Eberhard. And it begins to walk through, I haven't finished this video, but I'm about halfway through, where it walks through the claims made by Eberhard in this litigation document of how Elon Musk essentially, and I'm generalizing here, began his relationship with Tesla as an investor and then essentially took over the company and ousted Eberhard and then demonized him consistently over a pattern of years. And the video also begins by talking about where Elon Musk came from before and in terms of, how he was fired from previous company, et cetera, et cetera. And it also makes the point before it goes into the litigation that there's this idea of many people asking the question, wow, what happened to Elon Musk over the last, I don't know, 5 years or whatever, 5 to 10 years? The video makes the point that this isn't some change, that this is how he has been with receipts, as the kids say, and showing all these examples of how this pattern of behavior is not a new thing. It actually goes back a while. And I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, or anything. And I certainly don't want to trivialize anybody's experience and the things that they go through. Now, there is a biography of Elon Musk made by the same person. His name escapes me. The same who did the biography of Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson. And I haven't read the biography, but at least in some of the things I've read, sort of reviewing the biography, it talks about this nature of Elon Musk. It talks about his childhood and the things that he experienced. And I think you raise a very important point. And there are many ways we could go with this, and I want to be mindful that our podcast today is coming to an end. But
coffee's almost finished.
The coffee is almost finished. But when you started talking about the desire to shape the world as we wish it to be, the Sim City, the Civilization, the Call of Duty and the StarCraft and all of those video games where you kind of do that. It reminds me in certain ways of my own childhood, because I grew up as a computer geek. I never actually was much of a gamer, but I wrote my first computer program when I was 9 years old. And it was my father who set up the development environment because he is also a software engineer. And yes, there was this feeling of, I can tell something in the world, in this case, a computer, to do exactly what I want it to do. And I can do it all by myself. And it's completely rational. It makes perfect sense. There's nothing messy about it. The only messy thing is if I make a computer bug, and then if I do that, it's my fault, and I alone have the responsibility to fix it. And there's certain magic about that, at least for some people. I would count myself in that box. The magic of something in the world doing exactly as you tell it to do. And there was definitely a time in my life, really going through my college years, where I was approaching the world as if I could break everything down into a series of equations and solve them. And so it was very difficult for me to deal with social situations, to understand people, to make sense of people, and really, by extension, to understand myself and to figure out why I, as a person, did not always seem to comport with some sort of rational and fully consistent structure. And the difference between me and Elon Musk is I don't have billions. I mean, there's probably many, many differences between me and him. But yeah, there's definitely a subset of people who approach the world as if they can reduce it to a series of equations that they can then inject different parameters into and get different outputs from. And there's a larger conversation to be had in that for another time, but I just want to share this because I feel like it fits within what we're discussing. Over the last few weeks, I found myself increasingly and regularly watching videos on YouTube of people designing and building their own computer CPUs from scratch and inventing their own assembly languages and programming, and basically as if it's the 1960s and 1970s again. And I thought to myself, why am I being drawn to these videos right now? It's not a new thing. I've had these sorts of ideas of like building things from the ground up every so often. Eventually, I realized, I was taking a walk one day and I realized, oh, it's because in a world gone mad, so to speak, I feel drawn to something that I could have control over, that I could understand. Agency, deterministic systems. And of course, I'm trained as an engineer, so I sort of think in those ways. And maybe there's an aspect of my personality, the desire to really understand why the world works as it does, that drove me into engineering. And it's been a long time coming for me to accept there are certain things that don't necessarily yield to rational analysis. And it also has been a long time coming for me to accept that not everything yields to my own power. Or to flip Thatcher, there is a such thing as society.
Yes.
And that's actually a good thing, at least for me. I believe it's a good thing. To work with other people, to build relationships with other people, and to come to knowledge about other people and ourselves by talking it through and by working through situations, and by not retreating into, I don't know, the spreadsheets and numbers. There's places for that, but not always. Sometimes.
So speaking of our childhoods, I want to end with an invitation to people listening to do this thought experiment, which is that I was born in 1970. So pick whatever year you were born. But if you going back, it was 25 years, like World War II, when I was born. 25 years ago was like around the time of 9/11. And that really freaks me out to think that I was born when World War II was only so recent. And now it's just as recent as 9/11 was, which feels really recent. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, time and perspective. But yeah, I'm so glad you had a chance to have a coffee with me, Chris.
I am as well, Heather. And as always, interesting things come up that I was not expecting.
Exactly. As it should be. So I'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.